The last broadcast, the on-air sign glowed red in the darkened studio, casting crimson shadows across Ethan Graves' weathered face. He adjusted his headphones, leaned into the microphone, and let his voice drop to the gravelly baritone that had become his trademark. It's midnight in the city, and you're tuned to WLNX 103.7 FM. I'm Ethan Graves, your guide through the darkness on midnight frequencies. Tonight, we're talking about the thin places, those spots where the veil between worlds wears thin. Call in with your experiences. The lines are open. He queued up the show's theme, a haunting melody underscored by static and distant whispers, and took a sip of his coffee, black and bitter like the October night pressing against the studio windows. 23 years he'd been doing this show, spinning tales of the paranormal, the unexplained, the things that lurk in shadows. At 49, he becomes something of a local legend himself. Not that he believed any of it. To Ethan, the ghosts, cryptids, and conspiracy theories were just content. Stories to fill the midnight hours and keep the insomniacs company. The true believers amused him, though he'd never admit it on air. His producer, Marcus, often joked that Ethan was the biggest skeptic in the paranormal radio business. Line 3 is flashing, Marcus said through the intercom. Caller says they've been waiting a long time to talk to you specifically. Ethan nodded, clicking the button to connect the call. You're on Midnight Frequencies with Ethan Graves. What's your name and what's your story? Silence, then a soft exhale, like someone gathering courage. I don't think I should give my name. The voice was low, trembling slightly, neither distinctly male nor female. They might be listening. Ethan suppressed a smile. Another conspiracy theorist. Good radio, at least. Who's listening, caller? He asked, injecting just the right note of intrigue into his voice. It doesn't have a name, not one we can pronounce. But it knows yours. Your real name. Ethan stiffened slightly. Graves was a radio pseudonym. Few people knew his legal surname was Graham. And how would it know that? He asked, keeping his tone even. Because you've been calling to it for years, Mr. Graham. Every night, spinning stories about the beyond, drawing attention to the gaps between worlds. It feeds on that attention, on belief. The caller's voice dropped to a whisper, and you've made so many believe. Through his headphones, Ethan heard something strange in the background of the call, static that pulsed like a heartbeat, then whispers too faint to make out. And then, unmistakably, what sounded like his own voice, echoing, "It's midnight in the city. Interesting theory," Ethan said, maintaining his professional demeanor despite a sudden chill. Are you suggesting my show has somehow conjured something supernatural? Not conjured, awakened. It was always there, watching you, since you were a child. Since Sarah. The mention of his sister's name hit Ethan like a physical blow. Sarah had disappeared when they were kids. He was 8, she was 6. The official report said she had wandered into the woods behind their house and gotten lost. They never found her body. Who is this? Ethan demanded, professionalism slipping. How do you know about? The line went dead with a sharp crack of static. He yanked off his headphones, heart pounding. Marcus, what the hell was that? Did you screen that call? No response came through the intercom. Marcus. Ethan looked through the glass partition to the producer's booth. Empty. Marcus's coffee sat on the desk, still steaming, his jacket draped over the chair. The on-air light flickered once, twice, then steadied. Technical difficulties, folks, Ethan said into the mic, trying to regain his composure. Let's take a quick music break. He queued up a song and stepped away from the console, rubbing his temples. The caller had to be someone who knew him personally, or perhaps a particularly devoted fan who'd researched his past. Either way, it was crossing a line. When he returned to his seat, his coffee mug had moved just an inch, but he was certain it had been on the other side of his notes. He stared at it for a moment, then shook his head. Fatigue was making him paranoid. The song ended, and Ethan resumed his hosting duties, deliberately steering toward less personal territory. Local legends, recent UFO sightings, the usual fare. For nearly an hour, the show proceeded normally. He began to relax. Then the phone lit up again. Line 3. He hesitated, then connected the call. You're back on Midnight Frequencies. If you're our caller from earlier, I'd appreciate. I'm sorry about before, the voice interrupted. It sounded different now, closer somehow, with an odd echo, as if they were speaking from inside a tunnel, or inside the station. But I needed you to understand the gravity of the situation. It knows I'm warning you, and it's not happy. Look, Ethan said firmly, I don't appreciate the reference to my sister. That's off limits. It was there that day, Ethan, in the woods. You saw it too, didn't you? Before you forgot. A flash of memory, summer heat, pine needles underfoot, calling Sarah's name. Something tall standing between the trees, too thin, too still. Not moving even when the wind blew. And then, nothing. Just the search parties, the police, his parents' grief. Who are you? Ethan whispered. Someone who knows what it's like to be haunted by it. I've been watching your show for years, recognizing the signs. The stories you choose, the questions you ask, part of you remembers, even if you don't realize it. The caller paused. Look at your monitor. Ethan's eyes flicked to his computer screen. For a split second, the display changed. No longer showing the broadcasting software, but a grainy black and white image. A forest. A small figure in a sundress, walking away from the camera. His throat constricted. What is this? He demanded, voice hoarse. It's showing you what it wants you to see. Testing the connection. It's been growing stronger through your show, through the stories, through the attention. And tonight it's ready to come through completely. The studio lights dimmed momentarily. When they brightened again, Ethan caught a glimpse of something in his peripheral vision. A tall, thin silhouette standing beyond the glass partition, where Marcus should have been. When he turned to look directly, there was nothing. I'm ending this call, Ethan said, finger hovering over the disconnect button. You can't stop it that easily, the voice replied. It's already in the signal. Every listener is a potential doorway now. But you're the primary conduit. It's been grooming you your entire career for this moment. The overhead lights flickered again. In the brief darkness, Ethan saw his reflection in the studio window. Except the reflection's lips were moving out of sync with his own, curving into a smile he wasn't making. What does it want? He asked, unable to tear his eyes from the window. To exist here, to feed, to be believed in. Entities like this, they starve in their own realm. They need our reality, our attention, our fear. And you've been setting the table for decades. The caller's voice was changing subtly throughout the conversation, becoming more articulate, more confident, less afraid. Tonight's your last broadcast, Ethan. One way or another. There was a note of something like pity in the voice now. It either comes through completely, or you cut the connection. How? Ethan's voice cracked. How do I cut it? End the show. Permanently. No more midnight frequencies. No more stories. No more belief. The thought of ending his career, his identity, sent a wave of panic through Ethan. That's ridiculous. It's just a radio show. Is it? Look around you, Ethan. Really look. Ethan slowly turned in his chair, surveying the studio. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but then he noticed the subtler wrongness. The acoustic foam panels on the walls were slightly misaligned, patterns that didn't match what he'd seen every night for years. The distance to the door seemed longer, the ceiling just barely higher, and the photographs on his desk, his parents, his dog, the station staff, all showed faces that were almost but not quite right. Expressions slightly too rigid, smiles that never reached the eyes. What's happening? He whispered. Reality is thin in your studio now. Think about it. How many stories have been told here? How many beliefs shared? How many fears confessed? All concentrated in one space, night after night, year after year. It's the perfect breeding ground. The soundboard suddenly crackled to life, playing snippets of old broadcasts. Caller says they've seen strange lights over Miller's Pond. Disappeared without a trace, leaving only a child's shoe behind. Locals refused to enter the abandoned Westfield Tunnel after dark. Ethan didn't remember any of these segments, yet it was unmistakably his voice. Those are my broadcasts, he said. They are, just not in this reality. It's been practicing, creating variations, testing which stories resonate most. The more it practices, the stronger the connection. Ethan's eyes darted to the digital clock on the wall. 2:47 a.m. The show was scheduled to run until 3 o'clock. 13 minutes left. If what you're saying is true, Ethan said, struggling to keep his voice steady, then why help me? Why warn me at all? A long pause. Because I was like you once. I had a show too, until it came through. And now I'm just another story he tells. The realization dawned slowly, horribly. You're not calling in from outside the station, are you? I'm not calling in at all, Ethan. Not in the way you understand. I'm already part of it. We all are. Everyone it's ever taken. Your sister, your producer, so many others. Ethan looked toward the producer's booth again. This time, he saw Marcus clearly, sitting perfectly still, headphones on, staring straight ahead with glassy eyes. As Ethan watched, Marcus's form seemed to flicker, like a television with poor reception. Oh God, Ethan breathed. Marcus, he's been gone since the first hour of tonight's show, the caller said quietly. It took him first to isolate you, to prepare. The studio phone began to ring again. Not the call screening line, but Ethan's private line, the number only Marcus knew. Don't answer that, the caller warned urgently. That's not me anymore. That's it, using what it's learned. If you hear its true voice directly, the connection will be complete. The ringing continued, insistent. The on-air sign began to pulse in rhythm with it. How do I stop this? Ethan asked, voice barely audible over the ringing. And the broadcast. Cut the power. Destroy the signal. It's your only chance. Ethan's eyes fell on the emergency cutoff switch, a large red button under a plastic cover, designed to immediately terminate all broadcasting in case of emergency. In 23 years, he'd never had reason to use it. If I do this, what happens to you? To the others, we stay where we are, in the in-between. But at least no one else joins us. The ringing stopped abruptly. In a sudden silence, Ethan could hear faint whispers coming from his headphones, which lay on the console where he discarded them. Hesitantly, he picked them up and held one earpiece close. Ethan, remember the woods. Remember what you saw. I'm still there, waiting. The voice sounded like his sister, as she would sound now. Grown up, but with the unmistakable cadence he remembered from childhood. Sarah, he whispered. The caller's voice became urgent. It's not her. It's using your memories, your guilt. Don't listen. But Ethan couldn't help himself. He slowly raised the headphones to his ears. You left me there, Ethan. You saw it coming for me, and you ran away. You let me go. No. Ethan shook his head violently. That's not what happened. I looked for you. We all did. But you saw it first. And you did nothing. Because you were afraid. Another flash of memory, stronger this time. Sarah ahead of him on the path. The tall figure stepping out from behind a tree. His feet frozen in terror. Sarah turning back, calling his name questioningly. Him, turning and running. I was just a child, Ethan whispered, tears streaming down his face. And now you can make it right, the voice crooned. Just keep broadcasting. Keep the signal going. I can come back, Ethan. We can all come back. The digital clock read 2:57. 3 minutes to the hour. It's lying, the caller said desperately. Whatever comes through won't be your sister. Won't be any of us. It will wear our faces, use our voices, but it will be something else entirely. Something hungry. The studio began to change more dramatically now. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting. The ceiling receded upward into darkness. The glass partition showed not the producer's booth, but a forest. The forest from his childhood. In his headphones, a chorus of voices now, all familiar, his sister, his parents, old friends, former colleagues, all calling his name, all begging him to keep the show going, to strengthen the signal, to believe. And beneath them all, growing louder, a sound like static but organic, like thousands of insect legs skittering across dry leaves. Ethan stood on trembling legs, eyes fixed on the emergency cut-off switch. I'm sorry, he whispered to the caller, to Marcus, to his listeners, to Sarah. This is Ethan Graves signing off. Permanently. His hand reached for the switch just as the phone rang one final time. Despite himself, despite everything, he glanced at the caller ID. He displayed his own cell phone number. The ringing pierced through him like a physical pain. His hand, stretched toward salvation, began to tremble violently. One final call. One final voice. his own voice from somewhere beyond. What would it say? What truth would it reveal? The temptation was excruciating. Ring, the forest in the window, grew more solid. A small figure in a sundress appeared between the trees, back turned. Ring. The skittering static grew louder in his headphones, drowning out the other voices. Ring. I have to know. Ethan whispered, his hand moving from the emergency switch to the phone. Then you've already made your choice, the caller said sadly. Goodbye, Ethan Graham. As Ethan's fingers closed around the receiver, the caller's line went dead that he lifted the phone to his ear. Hello. For a moment, silence. Then his own voice, but wrong, hollow, like words spoken into an empty cave, answered, It's midnight in the city, and you're tuned to WLNX 103.7 FM. I'm Ethan Graves. The voice continued, reciting the introduction to tonight's show word for word. But beneath the familiar patter, Ethan could hear something else now, a wet, hungry sound. The sound of something vast opening to lunge for the emergency switch, yanking open the plastic cover. But before he could press it, dawn air light flared blindingly bright. The studio windows shattered inward. The forest was no longer just an image. It was here in the studio, trees erupting through the floor, dark soil spilling across the carpet. The smell of pine and wet earth filled his nostrils. And from the headphones still dangling from the console came his own voice, continuing the broadcast as if nothing had happened. Tonight, we have a very special show for you. A story 23 years in the making. The story of a man who built his career on other people's nightmares, never realizing he was living in one of his own. Ethan's finger hovered over the emergency cutoff button. One press and it would end. The signal would die. The connection would break. But Sarah was walking toward him now, her back still turned, sundress swaying. Sarah, he called, voice breaking. She began to turn. Ethan Graves, veteran radio DJ, made his choice. Dawn air light continued to glow. The signal continued to strengthen. And somewhere in the darkness, in the in-between, a new voice joined the chorus of the taken. Woven into the static, another story added to the endless broadcast that late-night listeners would later report that the show had ended strangely that night. Just dead air after 3 a.m. until the morning crew came on at 6. When they asked what had happened to the popular Midnight Frequencies program, the station manager seemed confused. We've never had a show by that name, he said, and we've certainly never had a host called Ethan Graves. But in certain frequencies, if you tune your radio just right, in the static between stations at midnight, you might catch fragments, a gravelly baritone welcoming listeners to the darkness, warning about thin places, and telling stories of those who disappeared. And if you listen carefully beneath his words, you might hear whispers and the sound of something vast and patient and hungry drawing ever closer. Whispers from the deep DR. Elaine Foster pressed her gloved hand against the cold, slick wall of the underwater cave and shone her high-powered dive light across its surface. What had initially looked like natural erosion patterns from a distance now revealed themselves as something far more deliberate. Intricate geometric patterns carved into the rock face. Her heart raced as she traced the outline of what appeared to be a humanoid figure with an elongated head and webbed appendages. Marcus, are you seeing this? She spoke into her communication device, her voice echoing in her specialized dive helmet. Copy that, replied Dr. Marcus Chun, the expedition's lead archaeologist. I'm documenting everything. These carvings appear to be at least several thousand years old, but the preservation is remarkable. Elaine moved her light across the wall, revealing more carvings, concentric circles, spiral patterns, and what looked like a map of the cave system they were currently exploring. But something about it didn't match their sonar readings. The map showed passages extending much deeper than their preliminary scans had indicated. The Mako Trench cave system continues to surprise us, announced Captain Rivera through the communication channel. Day 5 of the expedition, and we've already made a discovery that could rewrite our understanding of prehistoric cultures. Elaine smiled behind her helmet visor. After 15 years studying marine ecosystems, this expedition off the coast of Palau represented the pinnacle of her career. a newly discovered underwater cave system unlike any other, untouched by human hands until now. The international team assembled for this mission comprised the best in their fields. Elaine specializing in marine ecosystems, Marcus in underwater archaeology, Rivera commanding their research vessel, and 5 other scientists and expert divers. The discovery had been accidental. A routine ocean floor mapping project had detected an anomaly that turned out to be an entrance to an extensive cave network 270 feet beneath the surface. Initial robotic explorations revealed unusual formations and potential signs of human activity, prompting this more thorough expedition. Dr. Foster, Dr. Chun were reaching the 90-minute mark. Came the professional voice of Kira Watanabe, their dive coordinator monitoring from the surface vessel. Begin your return journey in 15 minutes to maintain decompression schedule. Acknowledged, Elaine responded, but her attention had already shifted to something else, a narrow fissure in the cave wall that hadn't been visible before. Her light revealed that it opened into another chamber. Marcus, over here. I think I found a new passage. She approached cautiously, mindful of disturbing the fine silt covering the cave floor. As she neared the opening, a sudden current of colder water flowed from within, carrying with it the faintest sound, like distant voices whispering in a language she couldn't understand. Elaine froze. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Marcus asked, carefully maneuvering through the tight space to join her. "I thought I heard." She paused, listening intently, but the sound had vanished. "Never mind. Probably just water movement through the passages." Marcus reached her side, and together they shone their lights into the newly discovered chamber. The beams illuminated a space much larger than the one they currently occupied, its ceiling rising beyond the reach of their lights. "We'll need to document this tomorrow," Marcus said, checking his dive computer. "We're cutting it close on time." Elaine nodded reluctantly. Scientific discipline took precedence over curiosity, but as they turned to leave, her light caught something on the chamber floor, a small object partially buried in the silt. "Wait," she said, carefully approaching. Using a small brush from her equipment belt, she gently cleared away the sediment to reveal what appeared to be a figurine about 6 inches tall, made from a greenish stone. It depicted the same elongated-headed figure they had seen in the carvings, but with remarkable detail. Fine lines etched across its skin like gills or scales, 6-fingered hands, and eyes that seemed unnervingly deep-set and large. "Marcus," she breathed, "this changes everything." Back aboard the research vessel Oceanographer, the team gathered around the artifact, now resting in a preservation tank. "The material appears to be jade, but unlike any jade composition I've seen," said Dr. Amani Okafor, their geologist, examining the preliminary scanning results. "The density and molecular structure are unusual. Carbon dating will take time," Marcus added, "but based on the sediment layer and calcium deposits, I'd estimate it's between 12,000 to 15,000 years old." Captain Rivera whistled. "That's well before any known civilizations in this region." "What's most interesting," Elaine said, pointing to detailed images of the carvings they documented, "is the anatomical precision. These aren't mythological representations. They're almost anatomical studies. Look at the gill structures, the articulation of the joints. Are you suggesting these might be based on actual organisms?" asked Dr. Javier Ramos, their marine biologist specializing in evolutionary adaptations. Elaine hesitated. "I'm not making any claims yet, but these don't match any known species, extinct or otherwise." The implications hung heavily in the air. Either an ancient culture had an unprecedented understanding of speculative anatomy, or they were documenting something they had actually observed. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," cautioned Rivera. "We stick to the evidence, the scientific method. Tomorrow we'll return to the chamber where the artifact was found and conduct a more thorough survey." The team agreed, breaking to prepare equipment and review the day's findings. Only Elaine remained behind, studying the figurine in its tank. As the lab lights dimmed for evening mode, she could have sworn the carved eyes caught the light in a way that made them seem to glow momentarily. She shook her head and headed to her cabin. The pressure at those depths could play tricks on the mind. She needed rest before tomorrow's dive, but sleep proved elusive. In the quiet hours of the night, lying in her bunk, Elaine could swear she heard the same whispering sound from the cave, faint, indistinct, but somehow penetrating the hull of the ship, reaching her even here. Words just beyond comprehension, calling her back to the depths. The next morning, Team A, consisting of Elaine, Marcus, and Dr. Sophia Martinez, their marine geologist, prepared for the day's dive while Team B analyzed yesterday's samples and recordings. "You look tired," Sophia remarked as they checked each other's equipment. "Strange dreams," Elaine replied, not wanting to admit the whispers she thought she'd heard. Probably just excitement from yesterday's find. As they descended through the crystal-clear waters, Elaine felt an increasing sense of anticipation that bordered on anxiety. The cave entrance loomed below them like a dark maw in the ocean floor. They activated their lights and proceeded inside, following the guidelines they'd established over previous dives. The main chamber they'd explored yesterday seemed different somehow, the carvings more prominent, as if they'd been freshly etched into the stone. Elaine dismissed the thought. Their presence had disturbed centuries of sediment. The water clarity was simply revealing details that had been obscured before. They made their way to the newly discovered chamber, which they'd named Artifact Chamber in their logs. With more time to explore today, they set up additional lights, illuminating the vast space properly for the first time. The chamber was roughly dome-shaped, with a diameter of approximately 60 feet. The walls were covered with carvings more elaborate than those in the outer chamber. Entire scenes depicting the humanoid figures engaging in what appeared to be rituals around spiral structures that resembled whirlpools or vortices. These depictions are consistent throughout, Marcus noted, photographing each section methodically. These weren't random artistic expressions. They're telling a specific story. "Look at this," Sophia called from the far side of the chamber. She was examining what appeared to be a natural column of rock, but as the others joined her, they saw it was covered in a script, countless symbols arranged in vertical lines. An actual writing system, Marcus whispered, his voice filled with awe. This would be the oldest example of complex writing ever discovered by thousands of years. While they documented the column, Elaine noticed something else, a circular depression in the center of the chamber floor, about 10 feet across. The sediment seemed to disturb around it, despite the fact that they'd been careful not to swim directly over this area yesterday. She approached cautiously, brushing away the silt with gentle movements. The depression was revealed to be an intricately carved circular plate or lid, with a spiral pattern radiating from its center and handholds at regular intervals around its circumference. "I think it's some kind of door," she called to the other. As Marcus and Sophia joined her, all three became aware of a sound. The same whispers Elaine had heard the day before, but stronger now, more insistent. From their reactions, she could tell they heard it too. "What is that?" Sophia asked, her voice tense through the communication system. "Probably just water movement through narrow passages," Marcus suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. The whispers seemed to be coming from beneath the circular plate, growing louder as they examined it. Elaine thought she could almost make out words now, not in any language she knew, but somehow conveying meaning nonetheless. "Come deeper. See truth. Ancient ones wait. We should report this before proceeding," Marcus said, clearly unsettled. They contacted the surface team, describing their find. After a brief consultation, Captain Rivera authorized them to investigate further, but with extreme caution and strict time limits. Working together, the three scientists carefully positioned themselves around the circular plate. Using tools designed for underwater archaeology, they gradually loosened the ancient seal. As the plate began to move, the whispers intensified, now accompanied by a low humming vibration they could feel through their suits. With a final push, the heavy stone lid slid aside, revealing a perfectly circular vertical shaft descending into darkness. The whispers now poured from the opening like a chorus of distant voices. "The sonar didn't detect this," Sophia said, checking her instruments. "It should have shown a void this size. Something about the stone composition must have blocked the signals." Marcus suggested. Elaine shone her light down the shaft. The beam penetrated about 30 feet before the darkness seemed to swallow it. I'm going to take a closer look. Elaine, wait. Marcus cautioned, but she had already begun her careful descent into the shaft. The walls were smooth, almost polished, with more of the script running in vertical lines from top to bottom. As she descended, the whispers grew clearer, more distinct. Individual voices began to separate themselves from the chorus, some deep and resonant, others high and melodic, all speaking in that same unknown language that somehow conveyed impressions rather than specific words. Ancient home, return. Beneath, deeper point 20 feet down, the shaft opened into another chamber, far larger than the one above. Elaine gasped as her light revealed its contents. The chamber was filled with artifacts, statues, vessels, objects she couldn't begin to identify, all made from the same greenish stone as the figurine they'd found. But most striking were the remains. Hundreds of skeletal forms resting in recesses cut into the walls, their bones altered by time and mineralization, but clearly not human. The elongated skulls, extra fingers, and subtly different spinal structures matched the figures in the carvings. Marcus, Sophia, you need to see this, she called, her scientific mind racing to process what she was seeing. This wasn't just evidence of an ancient civilization. It was evidence of something else entirely. As her colleagues joined her, the whispers grew more insistent. One of the dive lights flickered momentarily. "This is impossible," Sophia whispered, examining one of the skeletal remains. The bone density and composition. These couldn't have evolved on Earth. Not on land, at least, Elaine said, a theory forming in her mind. But the oceans have always been Earth's greatest unknown. What if a separate intelligent species evolved in the deep, completely isolated from surface life? Even so, there's no evolutionary path that explains this level of divergence. Marcus countered. Unless, he didn't finish the thought, but Elaine knew what he was thinking. Unless they didn't originate on Earth at all. The whispers suddenly aligned into a single voice, loud enough that they all turned in unison toward its source, a doorway at the far end of the chamber, leading deeper still. Come. Last chamber. Truth waits. Home calls. We should go back, Sophia said, her voice shaking slightly. This is beyond our mission parameters. We need specialists, more equipment. Our air is at the halfway point. Marcus added, checking his gauge. We need to start back soon to maintain our decompression schedule. But Elaine felt drawn toward the doorway, the whispers now forming clearer impressions in her mind. Images of vast underwater cities, of beings moving through ancient oceans, of knowledge preserved through millennia. Just a quick look, she said. 5 minutes. Before they could stop her, she swam toward the doorway. The passage beyond sloped downward, leading to yet another chamber. As she entered, her light revealed a sight that stopped her cold. In the center of the circular room stood what could only be described as an altar, a raised platform of the green stone, above which hovered a sphere of what appeared to be water, but behaving impossibly, maintaining its perfect shape without a container, swirling with bioluminescent particles that cast an eerie blue glow throughout the chamber. And within this sphere, something moved, shapes that formed and dissolved, suggesting figures like those in the carvings, but composed of light and fluid. The whispers here were overwhelming, no longer coming from all around, but emanating directly from the sphere itself. Last ones. Preserved. Waiting. Join. Elaine felt herself moving forward as if in a trance, drawn to the sphere. Some part of her mind registered Marcus and Sophia entering the chamber behind her, calling her name in alarmed voices, but they sounded distant, unimportant compared to the ancient voices calling to her. As she approached the sphere, images flooded her mind. A civilization that had thrived in Earth's oceans millions of years before humans evolved. Beings that had mastered biological technologies rather than mechanical ones. Their greatest achievement being the preservation of their consciousness. When facing extinction from a cosmic disaster that had altered Earth's oceans, last refuge. Consciousness preserved. Need bodies. Return with sudden clarity, Elaine realized the danger. She tried to back away, but found herself unable to move. The sphere pulsed, a tendril of the impossible water extending toward her. "Elaine!" Marcus shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her backward with all his strength. The connection broke, and Elaine found herself able to move again, retreating with Marcus toward the entrance. But Sophia had moved closer to the sphere, her hand outstretched in apparent fascination. "The mathematical perfection," she whispered. "The biological preservation method. It's beautiful. Sophia, don't." Elaine called, but it was too late. The tendril of living water touched Sophia's outstretched hand and immediately enveloped her dive helmet. For a moment, they could see her expression change from wonder to terror, and then to something else, a serene smile that didn't belong on her face. When Sophia turned to face them, her eyes glowed with the same bioluminescence as the sphere. When she spoke through the communication system, her voice overlaid with others, the whispers now using her vocal cords. "We have waited so long in darkness. You will help us return." Marcus pulled Elaine toward the exit. "We need to go. Now." As they fled, Sophia, or whatever now controlled her, followed with unnatural speed and grace through the water. The whispers grew to a roar throughout the cave system, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse with bioluminescent light that hadn't been there before. They reached the main chamber to find a nightmare scenario. The remainder of their dive team had descended to check on them after their communications had become sporadic. All 4 additional divers now floated in the main chamber, their eyes glowing with the same blue light, moving with the same unnatural coordination. "No escape," came Sophia's voice, distorted beyond recognition. "Your kind destroyed our world with your warming seas and acidification. Now you will help us rebuild." "The entrance," Marcus gasped, pulling Elaine toward the cave opening. But as they approached, the possessed divers moved to block their path, that Elaine's scientific mind raced even as fear threatened to overwhelm her. The sphere, the preserved consciousness, it was using the cave system itself as a kind of biological computer, storing the minds of an ancient species. The carvings weren't a record left by humans. They were instructions left by these beings for their eventual return, and now they had human hosts. The artifact, she suddenly realized. The figurine we brought up, it was a beacon activating when we removed it from the cave. That's why the whispers reached us on the ship. One of the possessed divers lunged for them. Marcus dodged, pulling Elaine behind a rock formation. "We need a distraction," he said. Elaine nodded, unclipping a sampling canister from her belt. It contained compressed air for collecting sediment. She released the valve and threw it toward the far wall of the chamber. The canister rocketed through the water, colliding with the ancient carvings and loosening a shower of rocks and debris. As the possessed divers turned toward the disturbance, Marcus and Elaine made their break for the entrance. They escaped into open water, frantically swimming upward, but a quick glance back revealed their possessed teammates in pursuit, moving with frightening speed. "Kira," Elaine called into her communication system. "Emergency ascent protocol. The team is compromised." Only static answered. Either the communication system had failed, or something was blocking their signal. "We'll have to surface on our own," Marcus said grimly. "But we'll need to decompress, or we'll get the bends." "No time," Elaine responded, watching as their pursuers gained on them. "We'll have to risk emergency decompression on the ship." They ascended as rapidly as they dared, but they both knew the possessed divers would reach them before they got to the surface. Already, Sophia was only 20 feet behind them, her movements through the water more fish than human. Then Elaine had an idea. "The figurine," she said. "It's their connection, their beacon. We need to get it back to the cave." "How?" Marcus asked. "We can't go back down there." "No, but we can bring the ship to us." Elaine switched her emergency beacon to active, sending a distress signal to the oceanographer. Then she reached for her dive knife. Sophia closed in, hand outstretched to grab Elaine's fin. Elaine turned suddenly and slashed at Sophia's air hose. The regulator ripped away, bubbles exploding from the damaged equipment. The possessed Sophia didn't even react to the loss of air supply, continuing her pursuit with the same unnatural smile. But the move had bought them seconds. Above, they could see the dim outline of the oceanographer, alerted by the emergency beacon and moving to their position. "We just need to get aboard before them." Elaine gasped, her lungs burning from the rapid ascent. They reached the surface 100 yards from the ship, waving frantically. A rescue boat was already being lowered. Behind them, the possessed divers began to surface, moving in perfect synchronization. The boat reached them, hands pulling them aboard. "The others?" asked a crewman. Compromised, Marcus managed between breaths. "Don't let them aboard. And we need emergency decompression now." As they sped toward the ship, Elaine saw Captain Rivera on deck, directing the emergency response. She prayed the captain would heed their warning about the others. Hours later, after emergency decompression treatment in the ship's chamber, Elaine and Marcus sat in the captain's quarters, still shaking from their experience. The possessed divers have been denied entry to the ship and now circled in the water below like sharks, occasionally calling up in their distorted voices. "The artifact," Elaine insisted, despite the medical officer's recommendation that she rest. "We need to return it to the cave." "Absolutely not," Captain Rivera said firmly. "We've lost 5 crew members to whatever this is. I've called for emergency evacuation. A military vessel is en route." "You don't understand," Marcus said. "The whispers are getting louder. The artifact is calling them. More will come." Even as he spoke, the ship's communication officer burst in. "Captain, you need to see this." He handed over a tablet displaying satellite imagery. Dozens of small boats were converging on their position from the direction of Palau and other nearby islands. "What are they doing?" Rivera asked. They're jumping into the water," the officer said, his voice shaking. "Hundreds of them, and they're swimming this way." Elaine felt the whispers growing in her mind again. The artifact wasn't just a beacon for those already possessed. It was a call to anyone within range, growing stronger by the hour. "We need to destroy it," she decided. "The military will handle this," Rivera insisted. "They won't get here in time," Marcus countered, pointing to the radar showing the approaching boats. "And what will they do? Bomb the area? Kill innocent people being controlled by something they don't understand?" After a tense debate, Rivera reluctantly agreed to a desperate plan. They would return the artifact to the cave, hoping it would satisfy whatever consciousness was using it to expand its influence. But they would also plant explosives at key structural points, collapsing the cave system and hopefully trapping the entity within. Elaine volunteered to pilot the small submersible used for close-quarters research. Though not certified, she had basic training and was the only logical choice. Already exposed to the whispers, she had proven she could resist them, at least temporarily. They loaded the artifact into a pressure container on the submersible. Elaine could feel its pull strengthening, the whispers becoming more coherent, promising knowledge, power, continuity. She understood now how Sophia had been enthralled so quickly. "If I don't return in 2 hours, detonate the explosives anyway," she told Rivera as she prepared to launch. Marcus gripped her hand briefly, no words necessary between them. The descent in the submersible was quicker than their dive had been. As she approached the cave entrance, Elaine could see the possessed divers gathered there, waiting, somehow knowing she was coming. Their eyes glowed bright enough to be visible from a distance, and they moved aside in unison as she approached. The submersible was small enough to enter the main chamber, where Elaine was met with an incredible sight. The walls now pulsed with bioluminescence, the carvings seeming to move and shift as if alive. The whispers surrounded her, even through the submersible's hull. "Return artifact. Join us." Perfect union. Working quickly, Elaine placed the explosive charges at the points their geologist had identified before being possessed, each with a remote detonator linked to a timer. Then she navigated to the chamber with the circular plate. The possessed divers followed, but made no move to stop her. They seemed to know what she intended and welcomed it. This made her increasingly uneasy to eye in the chamber. The circular plate had been completely removed. The shaft now glowed with the same blue light as the sphere below. Taking a deep breath, Elaine guided the submersible into the shaft and down into the repository chamber with its hundreds of skeletal remains. The skeletons were no longer still, though still bound by their ancient bones. They moved subtly, turning their elongated skulls to track her progress. The whispers were now a deafening chorus. In the final chamber, the sphere had grown, now nearly filling the space from floor to ceiling. Within it, shapes moved with greater definition, figures almost fully formed, waiting. The possessed members of her team floated around it in a circle, their movements ritualistic. Sophia approached the submersible, placing her hand on the viewport. Through the communication system that still linked their dive helmets, her distorted voice came through. "You have returned our call. Now we shall return. I brought back what we took," Elaine said, keeping her voice steady. "Now release my friends. They are not imprisoned. They are evolved, as you will be." The sphere pulsed, tendrils extending toward the submersible. Elaine quickly released the container holding the figurine, pushing it toward the sphere with the submersible's mechanical ARM.AS. The artifact touched the sphere. A blinding flash of blue light filled the chamber. The sphere expanded explosively, engulfing the artifact, the possessed divers, and lapping at the edges of the submersible. Elaine felt the vessel shudder as the water around it behaved impossibly, pressing in on all sides. Through the viewport, she watched in horror as the possessed divers began to change. Their dive suits split open as their bodies elongated, fingers extending and webbing, skulls reshaping beneath their helmets, which they now removed, revealing gills forming along their necks. The transformation wasn't being forced upon them. They welcomed it, their expressions blissful despite what must have been excruciating pain. They were becoming like the beings depicted in the carvings, their humanity being rewritten, and the whispers now formed a single, powerful voice that reverberated through Elaine's mind. "Join us." Last step in evolution. Perfect adaptation for dying world. Images flooded her consciousness. Earth's oceans rising, land becoming uninhabitable, and these transformed beings thriving in the new world. Not an invasion, but a merging. Not the end of humanity, but its transformation into something that could survive what was coming. For a moment, Elaine wavered. The logic seemed sound, the future it showed inevitable. Perhaps this was evolution's answer to the crisis humans had created. But then she saw Marcus's face in her mind, his humanity, his individuality. The cost was too high. This wouldn't be evolution, but extinction of everything that made them human. With a silent apology to her possessed colleagues, Elaine activated the submersible's thrusters and began to back out of the chamber. The tendrils of living water surged after her, wrapping around the vessel, trying to hold it in place. The hull creaked under the pressure. A hairline crack appeared in the viewport. Water began to seep in. Elaine activated the emergency ballast release, sending the submersible rocketing upward with sudden buoyancy. The tendrils stretched but maintained their grip. The viewport crack widened. Water began to spray into the cabin. Elaine made her final move. She activated the remote detonator for the explosives, setting the timer for 3 minutes, just enough time to reach the surface if she could break free. The sphere pulsed angrily, the whispers becoming a scream of rage. The possessed divers swam after the submersible, their partially transformed bodies moving with incredible speed. But the vessel had gained too much momentum. As it shot up through the shaft into the main chamber, the tendrils finally snapped, unable to maintain their grip over such distance. Elaine navigated frantically through the cave system as the timer counted down. Behind her, the bioluminescence flared like a pursuing predator. The possessed divers were right behind her, their inhuman forms visible through the rear cameras. She cleared the cave entrance with less than a minute to spare, the submersible racing toward the surface as fast as its damaged systems would allow. Below, she could see hundreds of figures converging on the cave entrance. The people from the boats, called by the whispers, giving themselves to the ancient consciousness. 30 seconds, the submersible broke the surface near the oceanographer. The viewport was now half filled with water, and systems were failing. Elaine popped the emergency hatch and climbed out onto the hull. waving frantically to the ship. As the rescue boat approached, the water around the submersible began to churn and glow blue. Hands, some still human, others transformed into webbed appendages, reached up trying to grab the vessel's hull. The timer reached 0. Far below, the explosives detonated in sequence, sending shockwaves through the water. The rescuers reached Elaine just as the submersible began to sink, pulled down by countless hands from below. From the deck of the oceanographer, they watched as a massive bubble of displaced water rose to the surface, followed by a swirling whirlpool as the cave system collapsed in on itself. The blue glow beneath the waves pulsed once, twice, then faded. The people who had jumped from the boats floated confused on the surface, themselves again, rescued by the ship's crew. Of the possessed expedition members, there was no sign. 1 month later DR. Elaine Foster sat in a nondescript government facility, concluding her debriefing with military and scientific officials. For the 5th time, she had recounted every detail of what happened in the cave system. "And you're certain the threat has been neutralized?" asked General Harwood, who had led the official response. "The cave system is destroyed," Elaine replied carefully. "The immediate threat is contained." But prompted Dr. Yamamoto, the lead scientist assigned to the case. But the carvings showed similar sites around the world's oceans. If this was one repository for their consciousness, there may be others. The officials exchanged glances. They had already deployed submersibles to map the ocean floor around the coordinates depicted in the cave carvings Elaine and Marcus had documented. "We'll continue monitoring the situation," General Harwood said diplomatically. "You and Dr. Chun have been invaluable to this operation." After they were dismissed, Elaine met Marcus in the corridor. They walked in silence to the facility's cafeteria, finding a quiet corner to talk. "What did you tell them?" Marcus asked. "Everything I saw. Everything I remember." Elaine stirred her coffee absently. "What about you?" "The same." He hesitated, but not about the dreams. Elaine's hand stilled. Since their return, they had both experienced the same recurring dream: vast underwater cities, beings moving with fluid grace through ancient oceans, knowledge beyond human comprehension. And always, beneath it all, the whispers, not defeated, only delayed. "You carry us now. Seeds planted. They're just trauma responses," Elaine said, as much to convince herself as him. "Our minds processing what happened." Marcus nodded, but his eyes reflected her own doubt. "And the markings?" Unconsciously, Elaine touched the back of her neck, where a small pattern had appeared on both of them after their return. Faint blue lines resembling gills, visible only in certain light. "Radiation exposure from the cave." She recited the official explanation. "Temporary pigmentation changes." Yet they both knew the marks were spreading slowly, accompanied by subtle changes they had noticed but not reported. Increased lung capacity, enhanced night vision, and inexplicable comfort in water. What if they were right? Marcus asked quietly. What if the oceans are the future? What if this is evolution? Elaine considered this possibility, as she had every day since their return. The ancient beings had offered adaptation in the face of climate disaster, emerging rather than an ending. Was that really so monstrous? Or was it simply the next step in humanity's journey? "I don't know," she finally admitted. "But whatever's happening to US, whatever they started, we get to choose what to do with it. That's the difference." They finished their coffee in silence, each lost in thought. Later, as they left the facility, Elaine glanced toward the distant coastline. The ocean glittered in the afternoon sun, beautiful and mysterious as ever. For a moment, she thought she heard whispers carried on the sea breeze, not threatening now, but patient, waiting. The ancient consciousness had survived extinction once before. Perhaps it had always been part of humanity's destiny to carry it forward, not as conquerors or conquered, but as something new, a bridge between two worlds. Elaine turned away from the ocean and walked with Marcus toward the waiting car. Whatever came next, they would face it together, with their humanity intact, but perhaps evolving into something more. Guardians of an ancient knowledge, stewards of two evolutionary paths, now merged into one up behind them. The tide continued its eternal rhythm, washing away their footprints from the shore. The picture framed Martin Cole had always prided himself on his eye for the overlooked. 20 years as a private art dealer in Boston had honed his instinct for finding value where others saw nothing but dust and decay. Estate sales were his hunting grounds, those melancholy liquidations of life's accumulated treasures, where grieving relatives rarely knew what they were selling. It was at the Harrington estate, a crumbling Victorian in Wellesley, that he found the painting. Tucked behind a garish 1970s print in the attic, the modest landscape wasn't particularly remarkable at first glance. The oils depicted a quiet village street at dusk, houses lined with soft golden light spilling from windows, a few distant figures strolling along cobblestones. The technique was competent but not masterful, the palette subdued. No signature adorned the corner. "How much?" Martin asked the harried executor, a nephew who clearly wanted the weekend to be over. $20, the man said without looking up from his clipboard. Frame's probably worth more than the painting. And indeed, the frame was the more interesting piece. Hand-carved oak with an unusual pattern of interlocking symbols that Martin couldn't quite place. Pagan, perhaps, or some obscure folklore motif. He handed over the money and added it to his small pile of acquisitions that night. After hanging the painting in his study, Martin sat with a glass of scotch, examining his find. Under the soft lamplight, the village scene seemed to possess a peculiar depth. The shadows between buildings were darker than he remembered, the windows brighter. He made a mental note to research the frame symbols in the morning. 2.3 days passed before Martin noticed the first change. He was working late, responding to client emails, when something flickered in his peripheral vision. Looking up at the painting, he froze. A figure that had been standing at the far end of the village street was now positioned in front of what appeared to be a bakery. Martin approached the painting slowly. Convinced he must be misremembering its details, he studied it carefully, taking a photo with his phone for reference. Then he returned to his work, unsettled but intrigued. The next morning, comparing the painting to his photo, Martin confirmed his suspicion. The figure had indeed moved. Not only that, but there now appeared to be a small dog nearby that hadn't been there before. The changes were subtle enough that anyone else might dismiss them as tricks of memory or light, but Martin knew better. He'd spent his career studying details. Over the following weeks, the painting became Martin's obsession. He documented the changes meticulously. Figures appeared and disappeared. A woman with a basket moved from one end of the street to the other over the course of days. Clouds shifted position in the sky. Once, a window that had been dark suddenly glowed with light. Martin told no one. Who would believe him? Instead, he researched obsessively. He found nothing about living paintings, but plenty about the region depicted in the landscape. A small village in the Black Forest of Germany with a history steeped in folklore and witch trials. The symbols on the frame, he discovered, were ancient protective runes. Protective against what? He wondered. 3. The night everything changed, Martin had been drinking heavily. The isolation of his secret had begun to wear on him. He'd stopped taking calls from clients, had canceled dinner with his sister twice. The painting had grown darker over time. The golden lights from windows now seemed ominous rather than welcoming. The figures moved with more purpose, gathering in small groups, occasionally looking outward, toward him. It seemed. That night, through the haze of scotch, Martin noticed a new figure in the scene. A tall man in dark clothing stood in the center of the street, facing outward. Unlike the other figures, this one was detailed enough to make out features. Sharp cheekbones, deep-set eyes, a thin mouth set in what might have been a smile. And as Martin stared, the figure raised its hand in greeting. Martin stumbled backward, knocking over his drink. When he looked again, the figure had returned to its original position. But something had changed in the atmosphere of the painting. The village no longer seemed peaceful. In the shadows between buildings, Martin could now make out shapes that suggested violence. A body lying in an alley, a figure dragging something heavy, What might have been blood staining the cobblestones, he tried to remove the painting that night, but the frame seemed to resist his efforts, growing uncomfortably hot to the touch when he attempted to lift it from the wall. Point 4. Martin began to see them outside the painting first in dreams, then in waking moments. The villagers from the scene, going about their business in his peripheral vision. A woman hanging laundry in his bedroom. A child playing with a hoop in his kitchen. The tall man standing at the foot of his bed in the darkest hours of night. They never spoke. They simply watched him with eyes that seemed increasingly hungry. Sleep became impossible. Martin installed cameras throughout his home, but they captured nothing unusual. He consulted a psychiatrist who prescribed medication that didn't help. He even contacted a local parish priest who blessed the house but departed quickly, visibly disturbed by something he wouldn't name. The violence in the painting escalated. Buildings that had once been intact now showed signs of fire damage. Figures lay motionless in the streets. The tall man was always present now, always watching that. In desperation, Martin tried to destroy the painting. He took a knife to the canvas, but the blade couldn't penetrate the surface. He attempted to burn it, but the matches extinguished themselves before touching the frame. When he tried to remove it from the wall again, the pain was so intense he blacked out. Upon waking, he found himself outside, walking barefoot down his street in the pre-dawn light. He had no memory of leaving his house. The morning Martin disappeared, his sister arrived at his home after weeks of unreturned calls. She found the house immaculate, as if clean for visitors. In the study, a single painting hung on the wall, a landscape of a quiet village street. Looking closer, she noticed a figure that resembled her brother standing in the shadows of an alleyway, his expression one of terror. But that was surely her imagination, grief playing tricks on her mind. The painting unsettled her. She decided immediately to donate it, along with most of Martin's possessions, to a local charity. Within weeks, it had been purchased from a thrift store by a young couple furnishing their first apartment. At night, if they looked closely, they might notice how the paintings seemed to change in subtle ways, how the figures moved slightly, how new faces appeared in the crowd. And among them, a man who looked oddly out of place in modern clothes, his eyes constantly searching the boundaries of his frame, his hands pressed against an invisible barrier, mouth open in a silent scream. In time, they too would begin to notice the figures watching them from corners of rooms, from the spaces between doors and walls, from the darkness at the foot of their bed. The tall man would come first, always smiling, always inviting, and the cycle would begin again. For the painting wasn't merely a window to another world. It was a door. And doors, as the villagers had learned centuries ago, opened both ways. The frame symbols weren't meant to keep evil in, they were meant to keep it out. The clockmaker's curse eye. The acquisition Daniel Everett had always been drawn to timepieces. What began as a childhood fascination with his grandfather's pocket watch had evolved into a carefully curated collection that occupied a dedicated room in his Boston brownstone. As the founder of a successful tech company, he could afford to indulge his passion, hunting for rare specimens that told stories of bygone eras. When the invitation to the Christie's auction arrived, featuring the dispersal of the Blackwood Estate's legendary collection, Daniel cleared his schedule without hesitation. The catalog had highlighted several exceptional pieces, but one in particular had captured his attention. An early 19th century astronomical clock attributed to Friedrich Weiss, a German clockmaker whose work was exceedingly rare. The auction house's description was clinical. Lot 247, astronomical clock, circa 1824, attributed to Friedrich Weiss of Dresden. Silver and gold mechanisms with ebony and mahogany casing. Features include lunar phases, planetary movements, and perpetual calendar. Unique design elements suggest this may be one of Weiss's experimental pieces. What the description failed to convey was the clock's mesmerizing presence. Standing nearly 4 feet tall, its ebony casing was inlaid with silver filigree depicting constellations that seemed to shimmer under different lighting. The face wasn't merely a clock dial, but an intricate astronomical chart with multiple rotating disks showing the positions of planets, moon phases, and star maps with uncanny precision. Most compelling was the pendulum, a polished silver disc etched with symbols Daniel didn't recognize, swinging with a whisper-quiet rhythm that seemed somehow deliberate, almost conscious. The bidding for Lot 247 will begin at $75,000, the auctioneer announced. Daniel had set his limit at twice that amount, but as the bidding escalated, he found himself raising his paddle repeatedly, driven by an inexplicable need to possess the piece. When the hammer finally fell at $320,000, well beyond his intended maximum, he felt no regret, only a strange sense of inevitability. The auction house representative who approached him afterward wore an expression Daniel couldn't quite decipher. "Congratulations, Mr. Everett. The Weiss clock is certainly unique." She hesitated. "I should mention that this piece has changed hands frequently over the years." "Curious, really. Most collectors seem eager to part with it despite its value." "Any particular reason?" Daniel asked, signing the necessary paperwork. "Nothing specific. Just unusual circumstances, financial reversals, sudden relocations, health issues." She smiled professionally. "The typical vagaries of life, I suppose." As the clock was carefully packed for transport, an elderly gentleman approached Daniel. His tailored suit couldn't disguise the fragility of his frame, and his eyes, magnified behind thick glasses, had the watery look of advanced age. "I was the underbidder," he said without preamble, his accent faintly German. "I would be willing to offer you a substantial premium to reconsider the sale." Daniel smiled politely. "I'm afraid it's not for sale. I've been looking for a Weiss for many years." The old man studied him with surprising intensity. "You don't know what you have purchased, Mr. Everett. Friedrich Weiss made 37 clocks in his lifetime. This is not one of them. The provenance seems well established." "The provenance is a fabrication," the old man interrupted. "This clock was created by Alexander Weiss, Friedrich's younger brother. A brilliant man, but troubled. He pursued interests beyond conventional horology. I wasn't aware Friedrich had a brother who was also a clockmaker. Few are. The family preferred it that way." The old man pressed a card into Daniel's hand. "When you change your mind, and you will call this number." Before Daniel could respond, the man walked away, his cane tapping a rhythm that somehow echoed the clock's tick in Daniel's mind. The card bore only a name, Heinrich Weiss, and a phone number .2. Synchronization, the clock arrived at Daniel's home the following day. It took two specialized handlers to position it carefully in the center of his collection room, where it immediately dominated the space despite being surrounded by dozens of other timepieces. "Don't attempt to move it yourself, sir," one of the handlers advised. "The internal mechanisms are extremely delicate, and you'll want a professional to service it." "Of course. I know someone who specializes in pieces like this." After the handlers departed, Daniel spent hours examining his acquisition. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Microscopic gears visible through viewing portals carved into the casing. Celestial movements rendered with a precision that seemed impossible for the era of its creation. Most curious was a small compartment hidden within the base, revealed only when Daniel accidentally pressed what appeared to be a decorative element. Inside lay a folded sheet of yellowed paper covered with mathematical formulas and diagrams he couldn't decipher, along with spidery handwriting in what appeared to be German. He photographed the document before carefully returning it to its hiding place, making a mental note to have it translated. Then, following the auction house's instructions, he wound the clock with the ornate silver key that had accompanied it, feeling a strange resistance that suddenly gave way, as if something inside had awakened. The pendulum began its hypnotic swing, and the clock's tick, softer than expected for its size, filled the room with a sound that seemed to absorb all other noises. Daniel set the time to match his watch, noting with satisfaction that all the other timepieces in his collection showed the same hour, 8:17 p.m. That night, Daniel dreamed of gears and pendulums, of time stretching and compressing like an accordion. He woke at 3:33 a.m., his mind unusually clear despite the hour, and felt compelled to check on the clock. The collection room was bathed in silvery light emanating from the clock face itself, though there was no apparent light source within the mechanism. More disturbing, every timepiece in the room displayed a different time, despite having been synchronized just hours before. Only the Weiss clock showed 3:33, matching his bedside alarm. Daniel adjusted each clock and watch in the collection, attributing the discrepancy to power fluctuations or his own error in the initial setting. But as he turned to leave, the pendulum of the Weiss clock seemed to hesitate mid-swing, just for a fraction of a second, before resuming its arc. The following days brought subtle dislocations to Daniel's carefully ordered life. His assistant, Margaret, who had worked with him for 7 years, arrived at meetings with incorrect documents. Friends canceled plans, insisting that Daniel had rescheduled first. Delivery services appeared at his door, claiming he had placed orders he had no memory of making. Most disconcerting were the gaps in his own memory. He found himself standing in rooms with no recollection of entering them, discovered emails in his sent folder that he couldn't remember writing, and woke one morning to find his car in the driveway, with mud splashed along its sides and 57 new miles on the odometer on the 6th night after the clock's arrival. Daniel canceled the dinner meeting and returned home early, drawn by an inexplicable anxiety. He found Margaret in his collection room, standing before the Weiss clock with a fixed, vacant expression. "Margaret, what are you doing here?" Daniel asked, startling her. She turned, blinking rapidly as if waking from a trance. "Daniel? I don't know. I was at my apartment, and then..." She looked around in confusion. "How did I get here? You don't remember coming to my house?" "No. The last thing I remember is checking my email after lunch. That was hours ago." Tears welled in her eyes. "What's happening to me?" Before Daniel could respond, the clock chimed, a sound he hadn't heard before, a sequence of notes that seemed to vibrate through his bones rather than his ears. Margaret gasped, her eyes rolling back as she collapsed. Daniel barely caught her before she hit the floor, by the time the paramedics arrived. Margaret was conscious but disoriented. They attributed her episode to stress and low blood sugar, but the look she gave Daniel as they led her to the ambulance contained something beyond confusion, an accusation, or perhaps a warning. That night, Daniel removed the hidden document from the clock and photographed it again, then emailed the images to a colleague at Boston University who specialized in German history. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he retrieved the card the old man had given him at the auction and dialed the number. It rang 4 times before connecting to voicemail. A heavily accented voice instructed him to leave a message. "This is Daniel Everett. I purchased the Weiss clock at Christie's last week. I'd like to discuss it with you." As he spoke, the lights in his home flickered, and for a moment, the clock's pendulum appeared to swing in reverse.3. Deviation DR. Johannes Krebs, the professor Daniel had contacted, responded with uncharacteristic urgency. The message simply read, "Come to my office immediately. Bring nothing from the clock." The history department was mostly deserted when Daniel arrived. He found Krebs pacing in his cluttered office, agitation evident in every movement of his slight frame. "You have the Weiss synchronometer," Krebs stated without greeting. "I've spent decades searching for it." "The what?" His edges blurring. "You must use the key yourself. When a Mars indicator aligns with the North Star marking, insert the key and turn it counterclockwise 3 times. Daniel looked at the clock face. The Mars disk was indeed approaching alignment with a small star etched at the top of the dial. "What will happen? The document you sent me. Those aren't just mathematical formulas. They're temporal equations." Krebs gestured to a whiteboard covered with symbols he had clearly copied from Daniel's photographs. Alexander Weiss was attempting something revolutionary, or heretical, depending on your perspective. The old man at the auction mentioned Alexander. He said the clock wasn't made by Friedrich Weiss. "Heimer contacted you." Krebs looked shocked. "I thought he had died years ago." "You know him by reputation only. He's a descendant of the Weiss family and has dedicated his life to tracking down Alexander's work." Krebs tapped the whiteboard. According to these notes, Alexander believed time was not a constant, but a malleable medium that could be manipulated under specific conditions. That's impossible. With conventional physics, yes. But Alexander's work operated at the intersection of science and something else, what we might call mysticism today, though he would have considered it natural philosophy. Krebs pointed to a particular formula. This suggests he found a way to create localized temporal fields where time moves at different rates relative to the surrounding continuum. Daniel thought of the clocks in his collection room, each showing a different time despite synchronization. And you believe this clock actually changes time? Not exactly. Based on these notes, the synchronometer doesn't alter time itself. Rather, it affects perception and memory, creating discrepancies between subjective and objective reality. Krebs's eyes glittered with academic excitement. Alexander theorized that what we experience as linear time is merely a consensus reality. His device disrupts that consensus. That sounds more like psychology than physics. The distinction would have been meaningless to him. Krebs pulled a leather-bound book from his shelf. I've been researching the Weiss brothers for years. Friedrich was renowned, but Alexander was expelled from the Dresden Academy after presenting theories that scandalized his colleagues. He disappeared from public record around 1823, though rumors persisted of his continued work in isolation. He opened the book to a marked page. This is the only known portrait of Alexander. The engraving showed a gaunt man with intense eyes and a tight, mirthless smile. Despite the antiquated clothing and hairstyle, something in the face triggered recognition in Daniel. He had seen this man before, in dreams he could only partially recall since the clock's arrival. The synchronometer was his masterpiece, Krebs continued. Completed in 1824, it reportedly demonstrated his theories to a private audience of potential patrons. After that demonstration, 3 attendees committed suicide within a week. Another was committed to an asylum. Alexander himself vanished. What happened to him? According to family records Heinrich shared with the academic community, Alexander became convinced he was being pursued by entities he had inadvertently contacted through his experiments, beings that existed outside conventional temporal boundaries. Daniel thought of Margaret's vacant expression as she stood before the clock. You're saying you believed he'd attracted the attention of, what? Time demons? Krebs smiled thinly. A colorful but not inaccurate characterization. The documents suggest Alexander came to believe that what we perceive as time is actually a protective barrier, a veil between dimensions. His work had torn that veil. This is absurd. Perhaps. Yet you sought me out. Krebs studied him. What have you experienced since the clock entered your home, Mr. Everett? Daniel hesitated, then described the anomalies, the desynchronized timepieces, the memory gaps, Margaret's episode. Krebs nodded as if he'd expected these exact symptoms. The effect begins subtly but accelerates. The clock creates a field of temporal instability that gradually expands. Those within its influence experience discontinuities between memory and reality. Eventually, the dissociation becomes complete. Are you suggesting the clock is, what? Possessed. I'm suggesting it's functioning exactly as designed. Alexander built a device that manipulates subjective temporal experience. The consequences of that manipulation appear supernatural to those who experience them. Krebs closed his book. The question is why you specifically sought this clock. I didn't. It was just an auction, was it? Did you feel unusually compelled to acquire it? Have you dreamed of it before seeing it? Daniel's silence was answer enough. The synchronometer selects its owners, Krebs said quietly. Or rather, something working through it does. Heinrich believes it's been searching for a specific individual throughout its existence, someone with the right characteristics to serve its purpose. Which is what? To complete what Alexander started. Krebs's voice dropped to nearly a whisper, to widen the tear in the veil. As if in response to Krebs's words, Daniel's phone vibrated. A text from his home security system. Motion detected collection room. Attached was a video clip showing the Weiss clock. Its pendulum had stopped, yet the hands were spinning rapidly in opposite directions. As he watched, a shadowy figure moved across the frame, too quickly to identify, too substantial to be a trick of light. I need to go home, Daniel said, already moving toward the door. Wait, Krebs called after him. There's more you need to know. The curse can only be broken by. But Daniel was already gone, driven by a certainty he couldn't explain, that if he didn't return immediately, something irreversible would occur. Point 4. Reversal. The house was silent when Daniel arrived, but the silence had texture, a humming emptiness that pressed against his eardrums. The collection room door stood ajar, spilling cold light into the hallway. Inside, the Weiss clock dominated the space more completely than before, as if it had somehow grown larger. The other timepieces in the room appeared dull by comparison, their cases dusty and neglected, though Daniel had cleaned them just days ago. The pendulum hung motionless, yet Daniel could hear ticking, not from a single source but from all around him, as if the air itself were counting seconds. The clock face glowed with a blue-white luminescence, and the planetary disks and celestial indicators spun in complex, impossible patterns as Daniel approached. The hidden compartment in the base slid open of its own accord. Inside lay not the document he had removed earlier, but a small silver key of unfamiliar design that a sound behind him, a footstep or something approximating one. Daniel turned to find Heinrich Weiss standing in the doorway, looking exactly as he had at the auction, down to the same tailored suit. "You should have called me sooner," the old man said. "We have very little time now. What's happening?" "The synchronometer has synchronized with you. It's calibrating reality to match the resonance pattern of your consciousness." Heinrich entered the room with careful steps, as if navigating invisible obstacles. Each owner experiences the curse differently, but always according to the same progression: disruption, dissolution, replacement. Replacement of what? Of natural time with something else. Alexander believed there were entities that experienced time in reverse, beings to whom cause followed effect. He sought to communicate with them. Daniel thought of the pendulum swinging in reverse, and he succeeded, not in the way he intended. They became aware of him, yes, but what he interpreted as communication was something closer to infection. Heinrich approached the clock cautiously. These entities cannot exist in our temporal framework without a conduit, a physical anchor that bridges the gap between our reality and theirs. The clock, yes, but it requires more than mere proximity. It needs a mind to influence, memories to reshape, perceptions to distort. It needs you, Mr. Everett. Heinrich's watery eyes fixed on Daniel. Or rather, it needs what you will become if we don't stop the process. How? The key you found unlocks more than a compartment. It's the shutting key, designed by Alexander in his final moments of clarity, when he realized what was happening. Heinrich gestured to the clock face. There's a keyhole hidden within the celestial map. When the planets align in a specific configuration, as they're about to do, the keyhole becomes accessible. The old man reached for the silver key in Daniel's hand, but as his fingers approached, they passed through it as if through smoke. Heinrich's expression shifted from determination to resignation. "I feared this might happen. I exist now only in your subjective timeline. The dissociation is further advanced than I thought." "What does that mean?" "It means I've been dead for 3 days, Mr. Everett. You attended my funeral yesterday, though you have no memory of it." Daniel staggered backward. "That's impossible. We just met at the auction last week. Time is no longer reliable for you. Your experiences are being reordered according to the logic of the entities influencing you through the clock." Heinrich's form seemed less substantial now when I turned the key. If we're fortunate, a temporal reset. The clock will return to its dormant state, and the tears in your subjective reality will heal. Heinrich was fading now, his voice becoming distant. "But you must rectify Alexander's original error." "Which was what?" "He took something that didn't belong to him. Something must be returned." Heinrich's form was barely visible. "The clock will show you." With those words, he vanished entirely, leaving Daniel alone with the softly glowing timepiece. The Mars indicator edged closer to alignment. As it did, the silvery light from the clock face intensified, and Daniel became aware of shapes moving within it, reflections that didn't correspond to anything in the room. Faces pressed against the inside of the glass, their features distorted in expressions Daniel's mind refused to fully process. A high, thin sound emanated from the clock. Not a chime, but a sustained note at the threshold of hearing, painful in its persistence. The room around Daniel began to shimmer, reality becoming fluid at its edges. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with each tick that wasn't quite a tick. The Mars indicator touched the North Star marking, and a small aperture appeared in the center of the celestial map. A keyhole that hadn't existed moments before. Daniel's hand moved toward it, the silver key suddenly heavy between his fingers. As he brought the key closer to the clock face, resistance built in the air, as if he were pushing through invisible molasses. His ears popped, and sound became muffled. Images flashed through his mind, memories that weren't his. A workshop filled with gears and springs. A man working frantically by candlelight, his gaunt face matching the engraving of Alexander Weiss. A midnight ritual in a forest clearing, where participants stood around a stone altar bearing a cloth-covered object. The object was revealed, a small mechanical device resembling a pocket watch, but constructed of an iridescent metal that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. Alexander taking it, incorporating its components into his creation while the others protested in silent, slow-motion horror. The keyhole waited, now pulsing with the same blue-white light. Daniel fought against the increasing pressure, forcing the key forward the final inches. It slid into the aperture with a click he felt rather than heard. Turn it counterclockwise, Heinrich had said. 3 times as Daniel gripped the key to turn it. His own reflection appeared in the clock face, but altered, older, with eyes that held knowledge beyond his experience. The reflection smiled with Alexander's tight, mirthless expression. "We are beyond time now," his reflection said, lips moving out of sync with the words Daniel heard in his mind. "Why go back? What we could accomplish together." Daniel wrenched the key counterclockwise. The reflection distorted, stretched like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. The pressure in the room intensified until breathing became difficult. 1 turn complete. The faces behind the glass pressed forward more urgently, hands that weren't quite hands scrabbling at the inner surface. The high note rose in pitch until it became almost unbearable. 2 turns complete. Reality fractured around Daniel. He saw multiple versions of the room simultaneously, the collection as it was now. The room empty except for the Weiss clock. The space filled with unfamiliar furniture from another era. The house in ruins, open to a sky filled with impossible geometries. He understood now what needed to be returned. In the moments before completing the 3rd turn, Daniel reached into his pocket and removed his grandfather's pocket watch, the piece that had begun his fascination with timepieces. He placed it gently on top of the Weiss clock. "A life for a life," he whispered, though he wasn't sure why these words came to him. Time for time. He completed the 3rd turn. The key dissolved beneath his fingers. The clock face darkened. The pendulum gave one final swing and fell still. Silence rushed in like water filling a vacuum. Recalibration. Daniel woke to sunlight filtering through unfamiliar curtains. For several disorienting moments, he couldn't place his surroundings. A sparsely furnished bedroom with walls painted a soft green. Memory returned in fragments. This was his new apartment in Cambridge. He had sold the brownstone 2 months ago, shortly after inheriting his grandfather's estate in western Massachusetts. The collection was gone, each piece sold or donated except for a single mantel clock that now sat on his dresser. A simple Art Deco piece with clean lines and a pleasant, conventional tick. His phone buzzed with a calendar alert. Meeting with Heinrich Weiss Foundation, 2 p.m. Heinrich had passed away peacefully in his sleep 6 months earlier, leaving Daniel with unexpected responsibilities. The old man's will had established a foundation dedicated to preserving and studying historical timepieces, with specific provisions for locating and securing chronometric artifacts of unusual provenance. Daniel was to serve as its director. The morning newspaper lay on his kitchen counter, folded open to an article he had apparently been reading. Auction house fire destroys historical artistes. Christie's London reports that a fire in their storage facility has resulted in the loss of several valuable items awaiting auction, including a controversial astronomical clock attributed to German horologist Friedrich Weiss. The clock, which has changed hands frequently over the past 2 centuries, was scheduled to be the centerpiece of next month's Horological Rarities event. Authorities are investigating the cause of the blaze, which appears to have originated in the specific vault containing the Weiss piece. Daniel closed the newspaper, a sense of completion settling over him. Some memories of the preceding months remained hazy, a side effect, doctors had said, of the stress-induced episode that had hospitalized him briefly in the spring. But the important things were clear. The pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather now rested in a special display case in the Foundation's small museum, its modest appearance belying its true significance. No one but Daniel knew that its internal components had been forged from an iridescent metal that absorbed rather than reflected light, or that it had once been the heart of a device far more ambitious than a simple timekeeper in '01. But Daniel remembered how time had unraveled and rewoven itself when the synchronometer was reset. In a new chronology, the Weiss clock had never come into his possession. Heinrich had succeeded in purchasing it at auction, only to arrange for its destruction under controlled circumstances. Yet, Daniel retained enough awareness of those alternate events to understand his role. The Foundation's true purpose was to locate other objects like the synchronometer, artifacts that manipulated subjective reality, and ensure they could do no harm. As he prepared for his meeting, Daniel checked the Foundation's secure database on his laptop. 7 objects were currently under monitoring, with 3 more flagged as potential targets for acquisition. Each was innocuous in appearance: a music box, a Victorian camera, an Art Deco radio. But each exerted subtle influence on its surroundings, bending reality in ways most people would rationalize or simply fail to notice. The veil between dimensions remained thin in places, and other entities still pressed against it, seeking entry. But they would find no Alexander Weiss to facilitate their passage, not while Daniel maintained his vigil. He closed the laptop and glanced at his watch. The second hand swept smoothly around its face, marking time in the reassuringly conventional manner of properly functioning clockwork. Daniel smiled, comforted by its predictable rhythm. Time moved forward 1 second after another, just as it should for now.